He didn't even look at me as he handed her the Iron Peak signet, the ring that had been on my finger for 5 years. He just stared at her belly like it held the salvation of the kingdom and told the entire High Council that my womb was a graveyard and the pack needed a garden. To understand how Clara ended up fleeing into the forbidden Frost Pass, a mountain range so brutal that no wolf has survived a winter there in living memory, you must first understand the man she was running from. Caleb Stone wasn't just an alpha. He was the Alpha King of the Iron Peak clan, ruler of the highest and most unforgiving territories in the northern Highlands. His lineage stretched back to the old gods themselves, and his word was law across a jagged empire of cliffs, waterfalls, and snow-capped summits that kissed the sky. He was brilliant, ruthless, and for 5 intoxicating, soul-crushing years, he was Clara's entire world. They were true mates, bound by the moon, a connection so visceral that she could feel his heartbeat in her own chest, could taste his emotions on her tongue, could sense when he was restless in the night, even when he lay perfectly still beside her. The bond was supposed to be unbreakable, sacred, the kind of love that poets carved into stone and mothers whispered about to their daughters. But there was one glaring crack in the foundation of their perfect reign. She hadn't given him an heir. In the world of the Highland wolves, and particularly within the Iron Peak clan, an alpha king without an heir is a king waiting to be overthrown. For 5 years, the whispers had followed Clara down the frost-glazed corridors of the summit hall. She endured the pitying glances from the Omegas and the cold, venomous stares from the Council of Elders, especially Elder Voss, a gray-muzzled traditionalist who had never believed a gentle-hearted woman from the lowland Silver Birch clan was fit to be Luna of the Peaks. But Clara endured it all. She endured it because every night Caleb would pull her into his arms, bury his face in her neck, and swear to her that they had time. He promised her that their bond was stronger than politics, stronger than legacy, stronger than fear. He lied. It happened on the first day of the Winter Solstice Festival. The clan was preparing for the ceremonial lighting of the eternal flame, and Clara was in the great hall overseeing the hanging of the ancestral banners when the iron-bound doors slammed open. Caleb walked in, but he wasn't alone. Trailing just behind him, draped in furs lined with silver fox and silk, the color of fresh blood, was a woman Clara had never seen before. Her hair was midnight black, her eyes were the amber of a predator, and her hand, delicate, possessive, rested on the swell of her belly. The room went silent. Every wolf in the hall felt the shift in the air, the way the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant. Caleb stopped in the center of the hall. His eyes found Clara's, and for a heartbeat, just one, she thought she saw regret flicker across his face. Then it was gone. "This," Caleb said, his voice echoing off the stone walls, "is Tessa Mere of the Southern Thornpacks. She carries the prophetic heir, the child the oracles have foreseen, the child that will restore the Iron Peak to its rightful glory." Clara's legs went numb. "And as of this moment," Caleb continued, his gaze never leaving hers, "she is my consort, my priority, the future of this clan." He crossed the hall. Clara watched, frozen, as he reached down and took her hand, the hand that bore the Iron Peak signet, the ring his grandfather had forged in dragon fire, the ring that marked her as Luna. He slid it off her finger, and without a word, without ceremony, without even a flicker of hesitation, he turned and placed it on Tessa's hand. The emerald-veined moonstone that had belonged to Clara's mother, a sacred heirloom she had entrusted to Caleb on their wedding night, was pulled from his neck and draped around Tessa's throat. The Council of Elders stood. One by one, they bowed to Tessa. Clara stood there, ringed by silence and betrayal, her breath misting in the freezing air, and realized the truth. The 5-year trial hadn't been a test of patience. It had been a trap, and she had been the sacrifice all along. The ceremony was over in less than 10 minutes. Clara was not given a chance to speak. She was not given a chance to fight. By decree of the council, she was ordered to vacate the summit hall by dawn and relocate to the Low Wolf Weaver district on the outskirts of the village, a place reserved for the pack's failures, its widows, its forgotten. But Clara did not go to the Weaver district. She went to the cliffs. The air in the forbidden frost pass is thin and tastes of ancient snow. It is a place where the wind howls in a language older than wolves, where the stone is sharp enough to slice through leather, and where the cold can kill you in your sleep if you let your guard down for even a moment. Clara, dressed in nothing but the emerald green gown she had worn to the solstice preparations, stood at the edge of the Shatter Cliffs and looked back one last time at the village below. She could see the smoke rising from the hall. She could see the eternal flame being lit. She could see Caleb standing on the balcony, his arm around Tessa, his face illuminated by the fire. He was watching her. She knew he could see her, knew that he had sent his elite wind trackers to follow her, to ensure she didn't do anything reckless. But as Clara turned her back on the only life she had ever known and began her climb into the vertical wilderness of the high peak, she felt something crack open inside her chest. Not her heart, her wolf. For the first time in 5 years, her wolf did not howl in grief. It howled in rage, and Clara climbed higher. If you made it this far, you're invested. You want to know if Clara survives. You want to know if Caleb ever finds her. You want to know what happens when the truth about Tessa comes to light. But here's the thing. I can't keep telling these stories if you don't help me. The algorithm is ruthless. It doesn't reward effort, it rewards engagement. So if this story moved you, if it made you feel something, I need you to do 3 things. Like this video, comment below, share it with someone who loves a good revenge story. Tell me what you think Clara should do. Tell me if you'd forgive Caleb. Tell me if you've ever been betrayed by someone you thought would never hurt you. Your voice matters. Let's make sure this story reaches the people who need it. Thank you for being here. Now let's see what happens next. Chapter 1. The Silvering of the Peak. The breaking of a mate bond is not supposed to be a public spectacle. It is supposed to happen in the sacred grove under the light of a blood moon, witnessed only by the elders and the moon priestess, with prayers and rituals that honor the gravity of severing a connection forged by the gods themselves. It is supposed to hurt both parties equally, a shared agony that reminds you why bonds are not meant to be broken. But Caleb Stone did not take Clara to the sacred grove. He broke her in front of 300 wolves in the Grand Summit Hall during the most important night of the year. The Winter Solstice Gala was the Iron Peak clan's oldest tradition, a night when every wolf from the highest peaks to the lowest valleys gathered to celebrate the turning of the season and the lighting of the eternal flame. The hall had been transformed into something out of legend. Banners bearing the sigils of the founding packs hung from the vaulted ceiling. Tables were laden with roasted game and winter berries, and the massive stone hearth blazed with a fire so hot you could feel it from across the room. Clara had spent weeks planning every detail. She had hand-selected the musicians, approved the menu, ensured that even the lowest-ranking pack members would feel welcome at the high table. She had done it all because she still believed, foolishly, that if she could just prove her worth in other ways, Caleb would remember why he had chosen her in the first place. She was standing near the dais when the iron doors groaned open and the entire hall fell silent. Caleb entered first, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, his dark hair pulled back in the style of the old kings. He wore the ceremonial cloak of the Iron Peak wolf fur and midnight silk lined with silver thread, and the sovereign's crown, a circlet of black iron and dragon bone that had been passed down through his bloodline for 12 generations. He looked every inch the Alpha King, untouchable, unshakable. And then Tessa stepped into view. She moved like a shadow given form, her black hair cascading over one shoulder in glossy waves, her amber eyes scanning the room with the calm confidence of someone who already knew she had won. The gown she wore was obscene in its beauty. Deep crimson silk that clung to her curves and pooled at her feet like spilled wine, the bodice embroidered with gold thread in patterns that mimicked the southern thorn vines. But it was her belly rounded and unmistakable beneath the fabric that drew every eye in the room. Clara felt the bond flare hot and jagged in her chest, a warning that something was about to shatter. Caleb walked to the center of the hall and raised one hand. The musicians stopped mid-note. The conversations died. Even the fire seemed to quiet. "Wolves of the Iron Peak," he began, his voice rolling through the space like thunder over stone. "Tonight we gather not only to honor the solstice, but to secure the future of this clan. For 5 years, I have led you without an heir. For 5 years, we have waited for the moon to grant us the prophetic child spoken of in the old songs. That wait is over." He turned and extended his hand to Tessa. She took it without hesitation, stepping forward to stand beside him on the dais. "This is Tessa Mere, daughter of the Southern Thornpacks, chosen by the oracles and blessed by the moon herself. She carries the child who will restore the Iron Peak to greatness. She carries the future." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of the nearest table to keep herself upright, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Around her, wolves were already beginning to murmur, their eyes flicking between Tessa's belly and Clara's frozen face. Caleb's gaze finally found hers across the hall. For a moment, she thought she saw something flicker there. Regret, maybe, or guilt, but it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "As of this moment," Caleb continued, his voice cold and deliberate, "Tessa Mere is my consort and the mother of my heir. The laws of succession demand that she be given the honors befitting her station." He descended the dais and walked toward Clara. Every step echoed. Every wolf in the hall watched in horrified silence as the Alpha King crossed the room to his Luna, his true mate, his bound companion, and stopped in front of her. He did not touch her face. He did not speak her name. He simply took her left hand and, with steady fingers, slid the Iron Peak signet off her ring finger. The ring was warm from her skin. It had never left her hand in 5 years. She had worn it through every council meeting, every hunt, every long winter night when Caleb had sworn he would never let her go. He turned and walked back to Tessa, and without ceremony, without hesitation, he placed the ring on her hand. The emerald-veined moonstone came next. Caleb reached beneath his collar and pulled the pendant free, the heirloom Clara's mother had given her on her deathbed, the last piece of her family she had left. Clara had entrusted it to Caleb on their wedding night as a symbol of her faith in their bond. He lifted it over his head and draped it around Tessa's throat. The hall erupted. Some wolves cheered, others gasped. A few of the older females looked away, unable to watch. Clara stood perfectly still, her hands empty, her chest hollow. Elder Voss stepped forward from the council's table, his gray muzzle twisted into something that might have been a smile. "By the authority of the Council of Elders and the law of succession, we formally recognize Tessa Mere as consort to the Alpha King. All honors, titles, and privileges previously held by Clara Ashford are hereby revoked." Clara's surname, not Stone, not the name she had taken when she had bound herself to Caleb. They were stripping her of everything, even the identity she had built beside him. "You are dismissed from the high table," Voss continued, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "Effective immediately, you will relocate to the Low Wolf district and serve the clan as a weaver. You will not speak of this night. You will not contest this decree. You will accept your place." The bond between her and Caleb flared one last time, a desperate, agonized pulse that made her double over. She felt him in her mind, felt the connection they had shared for 5 years begin to fray and snap like a rope pulled too tight. And then, With a sickening lurch, it was gone. Severed. Caleb staggered slightly on the dais, his hand going to his chest, but he did not cry out. He did not reach for her. He turned his back. Clara looked around the hall at the wolves who had once bowed to her, at the elders who had smiled to her face while plotting her destruction, at Caleb standing beside Tessa with his hand on her belly, and she understood. This had never been about her failure to conceive. This had been a coup, a carefully orchestrated betrayal designed to replace her with someone the council could control, someone whose child would be theirs to shape and wield. She had been a placeholder, a beautiful, obedient placeholder. And now she was nothing. Clara did not bow. She did not apologize. She lifted her chin, turned on her heel, and walked out of the Grand Summit Hall with her emerald gown trailing behind her like a battle standard. She did not go to the Low Wolf district. She went to the cliffs, and she began to climb. Chapter 2. The Vertical Escape. The Shatter Cliffs earned their name honestly. They were a maze of fractured granite and ice-slicked ledges that rose nearly vertical from the base of the Iron Peak village to the edge of the forbidden Frost Pass, a climb so treacherous that even the most experienced hunters avoided it, except in summer, when the ice retreated and the handholds were visible. In winter, with snow covering every surface and the wind howling through the crevasses like a living thing, the cliffs were considered a death sentence. Clara began climbing them in a ball gown and silk slippers. She had left the hall through the eastern servants' entrance, moving quickly through the narrow stone corridors while the gala continued behind her. No one stopped her. No one even looked at her. To the serving staff, she was already a ghost, a former Luna stripped of her title and her dignity. By the time she reached the outer gates, the guards had received word of her demotion and simply stepped aside, their eyes averted in a mixture of pity and shame. She did not run. Running would have been too easy, too expected. Instead, she walked with her head high and her shoulders back, her emerald gown pooling behind her in the snow like a river of defiance. She walked until she reached the edge of the village where the stone houses gave way to scrub pine and jagged rock, and then she kept walking until the ground began to slope upward and the air grew thin and cold. The base of the Shatter Cliffs loomed before her, a wall of stone and shadow that seemed to scrape the underside of the sky. Most wolves would have looked at it and turned back. Most wolves would have chosen exile in the lowlands, a quiet life far from the Iron Peak and its brutal politics. But Clara was not most wolves. She kicked off her slippers. The snow bit into her bare feet immediately, a shocking, vicious cold that made her gasp, but she welcomed it. Pain meant she was still alive. Pain meant she still had a choice. She reached for the first handhold, a ridge of granite just above her head, and pulled herself up. The climb was agony from the first moment. Her hands, soft from years of council meetings and ceremonial duties, tore open on the rough stone. Her gown caught on every outcropping, the fabric ripping and tangling around her legs. The wind cut through the silk like it was made of paper, and within minutes her fingers were numb and her teeth were chattering so hard she thought they might crack. But she climbed. She climbed because the alternative was going back to the village and living as a Low Wolf weaver, spending the rest of her days in a freezing stone hut on the outskirts of the clan, watching Caleb raise another woman's child while her own womb remained empty and cursed. She climbed because she would rather die on this mountain than give the council the satisfaction of seeing her broken and obedient. She climbed because her wolf, silent and dormant for so long, was finally awake and screaming for freedom. An hour into the ascent, she heard the voices below. "There, I see her. She's on the cliffs." Clara looked down and saw them. 4 of Caleb's elite wind trackers, the fastest and most skilled hunters in the clan, standing at the base of the Shatter Cliffs with their faces turned upward. Even from this distance, she could see the torches in their hands, the bows strapped to their backs. Caleb had sent them after her. Of course he had. The Alpha King could not allow his discarded mate to simply disappear into the wilderness. It would look weak. It would raise questions. Better to retrieve her quietly, install her in the Weaver district where she could be controlled and monitored, where her silence could be ensured. Clara's hands found a narrow ledge and she hauled herself onto it, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The ledge was barely wide enough for her to crouch, but it gave her a moment to think. Below her, the wind trackers were arguing. She's insane. No wolf can make that climb in winter. The Alpha King gave an order. We bring her back. Then you climb after her, Garrett. I'm not risking my neck for a fallen Luna. Clara looked down at her gown. The emerald silk was torn and filthy, streaked with blood from her hands and dirt from the climb, but it was still vivid and unmistakable against the gray stone. In the torchlight, it would be visible for miles. A plan formed in her mind, desperate and reckless, but it was the only chance she had. She tore at the fabric, ripping away a long strip from the hem. The silk came away easily, and she tied it to a jutting piece of rock just above the ledge, letting it flutter in the wind like a banner. Then she tore away another strip and tied it further along the cliff face, creating a trail that led to the left, toward a series of switchbacks that would take anyone following her on a long, winding route up the mountain. But Clara did not go left. She went right, into a narrow fissure in the rock face that was barely visible in the darkness. The fissure was tight and claustrophobic, forcing her to turn sideways and squeeze through with her arms above her head, but it led upward at a steep angle, bypassing the switchbacks entirely. She had seen this route once, years ago, when Caleb had brought her hunting in the high peak. He had pointed it out as a smuggler's path, a secret way up the mountain that only the most desperate or foolish would attempt. Clara was both. She climbed through the fissure, her shoulders scraping against the stone, her breath echoing in the tight space. Behind her, she could hear the wind trackers shouting as they found the strips of emerald silk. "She's heading west. Follow the trail." Their voices grew fainter as they moved away from her true path. Clara kept climbing, her muscles screaming, her hands slick with blood. The fissure opened up after what felt like an eternity, spilling her out onto a narrow shelf of rock that overlooked the entire valley. She could see the village below, small and distant, the eternal flame still burning in the center of the hall. She could see the wind trackers moving along the false trail she had laid, their torches bobbing like fireflies in the darkness. And then she looked up and saw the mist. The forbidden frost pass began where the breathable air ended, where the mountain ascended into a realm of permanent winter and killing cold. The mist that surrounded it was not natural. It was a living thing, dense and gray and constantly shifting, hiding the peaks and the passes from view. The old stories said the mist was the breath of the old gods, a warning to mortals that they were entering a place where the laws of the living world no longer applied. Clara pulled the remaining tatters of her gown around her shoulders and stepped into the mist. The temperature dropped instantly, so cold that her next breath felt like swallowing glass. The world became formless and white, every direction identical, every sound swallowed by the thick air. She could no longer see the village. She could no longer see the stars. She was alone. Behind her, at the edge of the mist, she heard the wind trackers arrive. Their voices were muffled and distant. She went into the pass. Then she's dead. No wolf survives the frost pass. Not in winter. Should we follow? There was a long silence. Then, no. We report back to the Alpha King. Tell him she chose the mountain. There's nothing more we can do. Clara listened as their footsteps retreated, as the torchlight faded, as the silence of the mountain swallowed everything. She turned her face toward the invisible peaks above her and began to climb higher into the mist, into the cold, into the place where no one would ever think to look for her, into the place where she would either die or be reborn. Chapter 3. The Hermit of the High Peak. Clara found the tower on her third day in the forbidden frost pass, half dead from cold and exhaustion, her vision tunneling to a pinpoint of gray sky and white snow. She had been stumbling through a narrow gorge, using the rock walls to keep herself upright, when she saw it, a structure that didn't belong to the mountain, a column of stacked stone rising from the edge of a cliff like a finger pointing at the heavens. It was ancient. The stones were dark with age and covered in a crust of ice and lichen, fitted together without mortar in the old way, before the Iron Peak wolves had learned to work with iron and steel. The doorway was low and narrow, designed for wolves smaller than the modern breeds, and the wooden door had rotted away centuries ago, leaving only the iron hinges rusted into the stone. Clara crawled through the opening and collapsed on the floor inside. The interior was a single circular room, maybe 20 feet across, with a spiral staircase carved into the wall that led up to what must have been a watchtower platform. There were remnants of habitation, a stone fire pit in the center with a blackened chimney shaft rising through the ceiling, wooden shelves collapsed into piles of decay, shards of pottery scattered across the floor. Someone had lived here once, maybe hundreds of years ago, watching the passes for invaders or guarding some forgotten border. Now it was hers. She slept for 2 days straight, her body finally giving in to the exhaustion that had been building since the moment she started climbing the shatter cliffs. When she woke, the fire pit was cold and her stomach was a hollow, gnawing ache. The remnants of her emerald gown were frozen, stiff against her skin, the silk worthless as insulation. Her hands and feet were blue-white with early frostbite, and when she tried to stand, her legs buckled beneath her. She crawled to the doorway and looked out at the landscape. The mist had cleared enough for her to see the surrounding peaks, jagged and merciless, stretching in every direction. Far below, through gaps in the cloud cover, she could glimpse the valleys where the lower packs lived. But up here, there was nothing. No trees, no wolves. Just stone and ice and the thin, sharp air that made every breath feel like an accomplishment. If she stayed in the tower without food, she would be dead within the week. So Clara learned to hunt. She started with the mountain goats, shaggy creatures with curved horns and eyes like liquid amber that picked their way across the cliffs with impossible grace. They were wary and fast, but they had one weakness. They traveled the same routes every day, following ancient paths worn into the stone by generations of hooves. Clara watched them from the tower for days, memorizing their patterns, and then she set her trap. She used her wolf form for the first time since the bond had been severed, and the transformation was different now, sharper, cleaner, no longer tangled up with Caleb's presence in her mind. Her wolf was lean and silver-white, built for endurance rather than power, and when she crouched behind a boulder and waited for the goats to pass, she felt a clarity she hadn't experienced in years. The kill was clumsy and desperate, more luck than skill, but she brought the goat down and dragged it back to the tower. She built a fire using dead moss and a flint she found in the rubble, and she ate the meat half raw because she couldn't wait for it to cook properly. It was the best meal she had ever tasted. Weeks passed, then a month. Clara's body began to change in ways she couldn't explain. She grew stronger despite the meager diet, her muscles hardening from the constant climbing and hunting. Her senses sharpened. She could hear the goats from half a mile away, could smell weather changes hours before they arrived. And her scent, the signature fragrance that every wolf carried, unique as a fingerprint, began to fade. She discovered the black lichen by accident, a dark, spongy growth that clung to the north-facing stones of the tower. She had been scraping it off to clear a shelf when she noticed that her hands, coated in the lichen's oily residue, had no scent at all, not even the base musk of wolfskin. It was as if she had become invisible to the nose. She began consuming it deliberately, brewing it into a bitter tea that tasted like iron and earth. Within days, her scent had vanished entirely. If Caleb sent trackers into the pass now, they would find nothing. She had become a ghost. But it was the morning sickness that finally made her understand. She woke one morning in her second month at the tower and vomited into the snow outside the door, her stomach heaving even though she had eaten well the night before. She told herself it was the altitude, or bad meat, or some illness picked up from the mountain water. But when it happened again the next day, and the day after that, and her breasts began to ache, and her sense of smell became so acute that she could identify individual goats from their scent alone, she knew. She was pregnant. Clara sat on the stone floor of the tower with her back against the wall and pressed her hands to her stomach, feeling for something, anything, some confirmation that this wasn't another cruel trick her body was playing on her. But there was no mistaking it. The signs were unmistakable. She was carrying Caleb's child. The child she had tried for 5 years to conceive. The child the council had told her she was incapable of bearing. The child that had appeared only after she had fled from Tessa's presence. The realization hit her like an avalanche. Tessa, 5 years of trying, 5 years of failure, 5 years of watching Caleb's hope slowly curdle into resignation and then resentment. And in all that time, Tessa had never been far away. She had been living in the southern territories, but she had visited the Iron Peak clan regularly, always with gifts for the council, always with whispered prophecies about the coming heir. Clara had seen her at least a dozen times over the years, had stood in the same rooms with her, had breathed the same air. And in every one of those moments, Clara's body had refused to conceive. It wasn't her womb that had been the problem. It was Tessa. Some poison, some subtle magic, some hormonal suppression that only worked when they were in proximity. The council had known, or at least suspected. That's why they had brought Tessa into the hall as soon as they needed an excuse to dispose of Clara. That's why Tessa's pregnancy had been announced so quickly, so conveniently. They had been setting the trap for years. Clara stood and walked to the doorway, looking out at the frozen wasteland that had become her home. Her hand went to her stomach, protective and fierce. She didn't know if the child would survive the altitude and the cold and the brutal conditions of the tower. She didn't know if she would survive, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would never go back. Let Caleb have his consort and his false prophecy. Let the council have their political games. Let Tessa have the summit hall and the signet and the emerald-veined moonstone. Clara had something they could never take from her. She had the truth. And she had time. In the mountains, patience wasn't just a virtue, it was a weapon, and Clara was learning to wield it. Chapter 4. The Raven's Sight. The man appeared at the base of the tower on a morning when the sky was the color of old iron and the wind carried the promise of a killing storm. Clara was on the watchtower platform, scanning the horizon for the goat herd, when she caught his scent on the updraft. Wolf, but not Iron Peak. Mixed with pine smoke and something medicinal she couldn't identify. Her body went rigid. In 3 months, she had seen no one. The Forbidden Frost Pass was supposed to be empty, a dead zone where even the desperate didn't venture. Yet there he was, a dark figure moving across the snowfield below with the confident gait of someone who knew exactly where he was going. Clara descended the spiral staircase, her hand going to the makeshift spear she had fashioned from a goat horn and a length of wood. She positioned herself in the doorway, blocking the entrance, her wolf rising just beneath her skin in case she needed to shift quickly. The man stopped 20 feet from the tower and raised both hands in a gesture of peace. He was older than her, maybe 40, with gray streaking through his dark hair and a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. His clothes were layered and practical, furs over wool over leather, and he carried a pack that looked like it had seen 1,000 miles of rough country. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, pale, gray, sharp, and assessing, the eyes of a scout. "Clara Ashford," he said, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "The ghost of the Iron Peak. I've been looking for you for 6 weeks." Clara kept her spear level. "Then you've wasted your time. Go back and tell whoever sent you that there's nothing here but bones and empty stone." "No one sent me." The man lowered his hands slowly, carefully. "My name is Milo Thorne. I was the chief scout for the Iron Peak clan until Elder Voss decided my reports were too honest for his liking and had me exiled. That was 7 months ago." Clara knew the name. Milo Thorne had been a legend in the clan, a scout who could track a wolf through solid granite and read weather patterns 3 days out. Caleb had spoken of him with respect, but she also remembered the rumors of his exile, something about insubordination and refused orders. "Why are you here?" she asked, not lowering her spear. "Because the Iron Peak is dying." Milo's expression didn't change, but there was something raw in his voice. "And I thought you should know what's happening in the place you used to call home." Clara didn't move. "I don't care what's happening down there." "Liar." The word was soft but certain. "If you didn't care, you wouldn't be standing in that doorway with a weapon in your hand, ready to defend a tower you've been living in alone for 3 months. You'd have let the mountain take you on the first night." The truth of it stung. Clara tightened her grip on the spear. "Say what you came to say and leave." Milo sat down on a flat boulder, the movement casual, non-threatening. He pulled a water skin from his pack and took a long drink before speaking. "It started about 6 weeks after you disappeared. The water in the high summit began to taste wrong, metallic and bitter. Wolves started getting sick, not all at once, but gradually. Weakness, fever, joint pain. The healers couldn't identify the source. Then the livestock began dying. The winter stores started rotting despite the cold. And through it all, Tessa walked around with her hand on her belly, telling everyone that the sickness was a test from the old gods, a purging that would make way for the new era." Clara's jaw clenched, and the council believed her. "The council is terrified. Half of them are sick. Elder Voss can barely stand without assistance, but they're too proud to admit they made a mistake, so they double down on the prophecy narrative. They hold ceremonies every night, burning offerings, chanting prayers. It's like watching a ship sink while the crew argues about which god to appease." "What about Caleb?" The question was out before Clara could stop it, and she hated herself for asking. Milo's expression shifted, something like pity crossing his scarred face. "The Alpha King is not well." "Is he sick?" "Not in the way the others are. His body is fine. It's his wolf that's failing." Milo leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "He refuses to touch Tessa, won't sleep in the same room with her, won't attend the ceremonies. The council ordered him to consummate the bond as part of the solstice rituals, and he walked out of the hall and didn't come back for 3 days. When the elders confronted him, he told them his wolf screams every time he gets near her, screams like it's being tortured." Clara's heart twisted despite herself. The wolf bond was the deepest part of their nature, the instinct that guided them toward their true mates and warned them of danger. If Caleb's wolf was rejecting Tessa, it meant his animal knew something his human mind didn't want to accept. "He's been living in the North Tower," Milo continued. "Alone. Won't meet with the council unless forced. Won't hunt. Barely eats. The clan sees him standing on the tower balcony at night, looking toward the Frost Pass. Everyone knows what he's thinking about." "He's the one who broke the bond," Clara said, her voice hard. "He's the one who put that ring on her finger and told 300 wolves that I was barren and useless. He doesn't get to stand on a balcony and brood." "No," Milo agreed. "He doesn't, but that doesn't change the fact that he's looking for you. He sent the wind trackers into the pass 4 times. They found the remains of your dress on the lower cliffs and reported you dead, but he didn't believe them. He knows you're alive. He can feel it, even with the bond severed. That's why I came. Because eventually, he's going to come looking himself, And when he does, you need to decide whether you're going to hide or whether you're going to face him. Clara stepped out of the doorway, close enough now that she could see the frost in Milo's beard, the exhaustion around his eyes. Why do you care? You said you were exiled. The Iron Peak isn't your problem anymore. I spent 20 years serving that clan. I tracked every border, mapped every pass, trained every scout who came after me. I bled for those wolves, and I'm watching them destroy themselves because they were too stupid and too scared to trust the mate the moon gave them. Milo stood, shouldering his pack. I don't care about the council, but there are good wolves down there. Families, children. They don't deserve to die because of Elder Voss's ambition and Tessa's schemes. What do you expect me to do about it? I expect you to survive. Milo pulled a bundle from his pack and set it on the ground between them. That's a month's worth of preserved meat, salt, flint, and a real blade. Winter's coming in hard, and the goats are going to migrate lower in 2 weeks. You won't be able to hunt. You'll need supplies. Clara stared at the bundle. Why? Because you're pregnant. The words hung in the frozen air. Clara's hand went instinctively to her stomach, and Milo smiled grimly. I'm a scout. I see what others miss. You're moving differently, protecting your center, and your scent, even masked by that lichen you've been eating, has the undertone of new life. I'd guess you're 3, maybe 4 months along. Clara said nothing. The Iron Peak needs an heir, Milo said quietly. A real one, not whatever Tessa is carrying, if she's carrying anything at all, so you survive. You bring that child into the world, and when the time comes, when Caleb finally breaks and comes looking for you, you make him earn the right to even look at you. He turned and started walking back across the snowfield, his footprints dark against the white expanse. Milo, Clara called after him. He stopped but didn't turn around. How bad is it? Really? Bad enough that I'm risking my life to warn a ghost in a tower. He looked back over his shoulder. Tessa isn't what she claims to be. I don't know what she is, but she's poisoning that clan from the inside out, and if someone doesn't stop her soon, there won't be an Iron Peak left to save. Then he was gone, disappearing into the mist like he had never been there at all. Clara stood in the doorway until the cold forced her back inside. She brought the bundle with her and unwrapped it by the fire. The supplies were exactly as he'd promised, along with something extra, a small leather-bound journal and a piece of charcoal for writing. On the first page, in rough, angular script, Milo had written, "Document everything. The truth has a way of surviving, even when we don't." Clara stared at the blank pages for a long time. Then she picked up the charcoal and began to write. Chapter 5. The 9-month winter. The winter that year was the kind that made the old wolves tell stories by the fire, the kind that would be remembered for generations as the year the mountain tried to reclaim what the Iron Peak had taken from it. The snow began falling in the 4th month of Clara's pregnancy and didn't stop for 3 weeks straight, piling up in drifts so high that the lower levels of the tower disappeared entirely. The wind screamed through the passes with a voice that sounded almost human, and the temperature dropped so low that Clara's breath froze in her lungs before she could exhale it. But Clara didn't die. She adapted. She learned to read the mountain the way Milo had taught himself to read tracks and weather. She learned which direction the wind came from before a blizzard, which clouds meant snow and which meant ice, which animal sounds signaled danger and which meant opportunity. She rationed the supplies Milo had left her, making the preserved meat last by supplementing it with what little she could hunt in the brief windows between storms. She burned the collapsed wooden shelves from the tower for fuel, then moved on to mining the dead scrub brush that grew in the sheltered crevices below her position. And as her belly grew, she built. The cradle took her 2 weeks to construct. She had found a stand of mountain cedar growing in a narrow gorge a half-mile from the tower, stunted trees that had somehow survived the altitude by growing low and twisted, their wood dense and aromatic. She cut the branches with the blade Milo had given her, working in short bursts between contractions of false labor and bouts of exhaustion that left her gasping on the stone floor of the tower. She carved the pieces by firelight, using techniques she had learned as a child watching her father make furniture for their small house in the silver birch lowlands. The cradle was crude and simple, nothing like the ornate bassinet that would have awaited a royal heir in the summit hall, but it was sturdy and warm and made with her own hands. She lined it with furs from the goats she had killed, layering them until the interior was soft enough for newborn skin. She carved a prayer into the headboard in the old tongue, the language her mother had spoken before the Silver Birch clan had been absorbed into the Iron Peak. May you be stronger than the mountain and gentler than the mist. She placed the cradle near the fire pit where it would stay warm, and sometimes, late at night when the wind was quiet and the stars were visible through the tower's broken roof, she would sit beside it and imagine what it would be like to place her daughter inside it. She knew it would be a girl. She couldn't explain how, but she felt it in her bones the same way she felt the changing weather. It was in her 7th month that she started seeing the search parties. They came from the south, small groups of wolves moving across the lower passes with the careful, methodical patterns of trained trackers. Clara would watch them from the watchtower platform, her hand shading her eyes against the glare of sun on snow, counting the figures and trying to identify them by their movement. She recognized some of them. Garrett, the wind tracker who had argued against following her into the pass. Marcus, one of Caleb's younger lieutenants. Thea, a female scout Clara had trained with years ago. But they never looked high enough. They searched the lower trails, the accessible caves, the sheltered valleys where a sensible wolf would try to survive the winter. They called her name sometimes, their voices faint and distorted by distance and wind, echoing off the cliffs until the syllables became meaningless. They left supplies in obvious locations, bundles wrapped in oilcloth and marked with stones, an invitation for her to reveal herself. Clara never took the bait. She watched them from her perch in the mist, invisible and silent, and felt nothing but a distant, cold satisfaction. They were searching for the woman who had fled the summit hall in an emerald gown, the broken Luna who had chosen death over dishonor. They weren't looking for the lean, hard creature she had become, the wolf who could survive on mountain goat and lichen tea, who could read the weather in her bones and disappear into the landscape like smoke. On the 3rd search, she saw him. Caleb. Even at a distance, even bundled in furs and moving with the exhaustion of a man who had been searching for weeks, she knew him instantly. The way he held his shoulders, the way he scanned the horizon with that particular intensity that had once made her feel seen and cherished. He stood at the edge of a cliff overlooking the valley, and for a long moment he was perfectly still, his face turned toward the upper peaks where the mist began. Clara's hand went to her belly, feeling the strong, insistent kick of the child inside her. The bond was gone, severed that terrible night in the summit hall, but some part of her could still feel him. Some ghost of the connection they had shared whispered in her chest that he was in pain, that he was searching not out of duty but out of desperation. She watched him turn in a slow circle, his eyes sweeping across the landscape, and she knew he was looking for some sign of her, some proof that she still existed. The search party was calling to him, urging him to move on before the weather turned, but he didn't move. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, a king reduced to a beggar, searching for something he had thrown away. Then the wind shifted, and the mist rolled down from the peaks like a living curtain, swallowing him from view. Clara didn't see him again after that. The search parties came twice more before the deepest part of winter set in, but Caleb wasn't with them. She wondered if he had given up, if he had finally accepted that she was gone. She wondered if he was sick like the others, if Tessa's poison had finally reached him. She wondered if his wolf still screamed in Tessa's presence, and what that meant for the false prophecy and the child that might not even exist. But mostly, she didn't think about him at all. She thought about survival, about the child growing inside her who kicked and turned and seemed determined to be born despite the altitude and the cold and the impossible circumstances. She thought about the birth that was coming and the terror of facing it alone in a stone tower with no healer, no pack, no one to help if something went wrong. She prepared as best she could. She boiled water and stored it in clay vessels she fashioned from the mud in the lower gorge. She gathered clean furs and soft moss for swaddling. She sharpened her blade and built up the fire until it roared hot and constant. She practiced breathing through the contractions that came more frequently now, timing them by the movement of the sun across the broken roof. And when the 9-month mark arrived and the child dropped low in her belly and the first real contraction hit her like a fist to the spine, Clara looked out at the frozen wasteland that had become her kingdom and felt a fierce, wild pride. She had survived. She had carried this child through the impossible winter, through exile and betrayal, and the kind of solitude that would have broken most wolves. She had proven that she was not barren, not cursed, not weak. She had proven that the council was wrong, that Caleb was wrong, that every wolf who had pitied her or dismissed her or told her she wasn't worthy had been wrong. The first real scream of labor tore from her throat and echoed off the peaks, and somewhere far below, in the valley where the Iron Peak clan was dying of poison and lies, Clara hoped they heard it. She hoped they knew she was still alive, and she hoped they were afraid. Chapter 6. The Shifter's Mask. Milo Thorne had always been good at waiting. 20 years as Chief Scout had taught him that the right moment was worth more than 100 hasty actions, that patience was the difference between a clean kill and a wounded animal that would lead you into a trap. So he waited. He watched. He documented. And when the time was right, he struck. It happened during the midwinter conclave. The emergency gathering Elder Voss had called to address the sickness that had now infected more than half the clan. The summit hall was packed with wolves, their faces gaunt and their eyes hollow with fear. The winter stores were nearly depleted. The livestock were dead or dying. Children were being sent to lower packs for safety, and the council could no longer hide the truth. The Iron Peak was collapsing. Tessa sat beside Caleb on the dais, her hand resting on a belly that seemed impossibly large for her frame, her face serene and untouchable. She wore Clara's emerald-veined moonstone around her neck and the Iron Peak signet on her finger, and when she spoke, her voice carried the practiced sweetness of someone who had rehearsed every word. "The sickness is a cleansing," she said, addressing the assembled clan with the confidence of a prophet. "The old gods are purging the weak so that only the strong will remain to witness the birth of the prophetic heir. Those who have faith will be rewarded. Those who doubt will perish." Elder Voss, skeletal and trembling in his high-backed chair, nodded weakly. "The consort speaks truth. We must endure. We must believe." Caleb said nothing. He sat rigid and silent, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance. He looked like a man carved from stone, all the life and fire that had once defined him burned down to ash. He hadn't touched Tessa in months, hadn't shared her chambers, hadn't attended a single one of the ceremonies she performed in the courtyard. His wolf, the massive black beast that had once been the pride of the Iron Peak, was nowhere to be seen. It was as if the animal had retreated so far inside him that even Caleb couldn't reach it anymore. Milo stood at the back of the hall, hood drawn low, unnoticed among the crowd of sick and desperate wolves. He had slipped back into the clan 3 days earlier using a smuggler's route through the eastern passes, moving through the village under cover of darkness. No one had recognized him. No one had been looking. He waited until Tessa finished speaking, until the hall erupted in uncertain murmurs and Elder Voss began calling for order. Then he stepped forward, pushing through the crowd until he stood in the center aisle with every eye turning toward him. "I have something to show the council," he said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Caleb's head snapped up. His eyes widened with recognition. "Milo Thorne, you were exiled." "I was." Milo pulled back his hood, revealing his scarred face to the hall, for telling Elder Voss that his southern alliances were based on lies and manipulation, for warning the council that Tessa Mere was not what she claimed to be, for doing my job. Tessa's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her amber eyes, something cold and calculating. "Seize him!" Elder Voss rasped, but his voice had no strength behind it, and the guards who should have moved remained frozen, watching Milo with uncertain faces. Milo reached into his pack and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it slowly, deliberately, letting the silence build. What he revealed made the hall gasp. A smooth oval stone the color of dried blood, shot through with veins of black that pulsed with a faint, sickly light. "This is a blood mimic stone," Milo said, holding it up so everyone could see. "It's an ancient relic used by skin shifters to deceive their enemies. When worn against the skin, it allows the bearer to mimic pregnancy, to produce false scents and false symptoms, to convince even a true mate that they're carrying a child when their womb is empty." He turned to Tessa. "I found this buried beneath the water cistern in the southern courtyard. The same cistern that's been poisoning this clan for 6 months." The hall erupted. Wolves surged to their feet, shouting questions and accusations. Tessa remained seated, her hand still on her belly, her face a mask of innocent confusion. "That's impossible," she said softly. "I don't know what that stone is or where you found it, but I am carrying the prophetic air. The oracles have confirmed it." "The oracles you brought with you from the south?" Milo's smile was sharp. "The ones who conveniently died in a hunting accident 2 months ago, before anyone could question them further?" Caleb was on his feet now, his eyes locked on Tessa with an expression Clara would have recognized. The look of a man who had just realized he'd been played for a fool. "Take off the moonstone," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "What?" "The moonstone. Take it off." Tessa's hand went to the pendant at her throat, her fingers closing around it protectively. "This is a sacred heirloom. I won't." Caleb moved faster than anyone expected, crossing the dais in 2 strides and ripping the pendant from her neck. The chain broke with a sharp snap, and the moment the stone left Tessa's skin, something changed. The air in the hall went cold. Tessa's belly, so large and prominent just moments before, began to shrink. Not gradually, not naturally. It deflated like a punctured water skin, the fabric of her gown collapsing inward until there was nothing beneath it but her normal, flat abdomen. The silence was absolute. Tessa stood slowly, her face transforming from shock to fury, and then she began to change. Her skin rippled and shifted, bones cracking and reforming beneath the surface, her jaw elongated, her teeth sharpening into points. Her eyes went from amber to solid black, and her hands twisted into something between human fingers and animal claws. She grew taller, her spine curving backward at an unnatural angle, and when she opened her mouth, the sound that came out was not a human scream but something chittering and alien. A skin shifter, not a wolf at all. A creature from the old stories, the kind that wore stolen faces and fed on the fear and chaos it created. "Kill it!" someone screamed, and the hall descended into pandemonium. But Tessa was already moving. She grabbed the closest object, the summit chalice, a golden relic that had been used in coronation ceremonies for 300 years, and vaulted over the dais railing with inhuman speed. Guards rushed to intercept her, but she was too fast, her monstrous form tearing through them like paper. She crashed through a window in an explosion of glass and disappeared into the night, the chalice clutched in her talons. Caleb stood on the dais, staring at the broken window, his face white with shock and rage. The hall was in chaos around him, wolves shouting and crying and demanding answers, but he heard none of it. He looked down at the moonstone in his hand, Clara's mother's moonstone, the heirloom he had given to a monster, and something inside him finally broke. "Clara," he whispered, and the name was a prayer and a confession all at once. Milo appeared beside him, his voice low and urgent. "She's alive, in the Frost Pass. But if you want to find her, you need to go now. The century blizzard is coming, and once it hits, that mountain becomes a tomb." Caleb looked at him, and for the first time in months, there was life in his eyes. "How long do I have?" 2 days, maybe less." The Alpha King looked out at his clan, at the sick and dying wolves who had trusted him, who had followed him into disaster because he had been too proud and too desperate to see the truth. He thought of Clara standing in this very hall, watching him place the signet on Tessa's finger. He thought of the bond breaking, of her walking out into the snow, of the 9 months he had spent searching for her while she was alone and pregnant and fighting to survive in the one place he should have looked first. "Gather supplies," he said to Milo. "Enough for a week, and find me the best cold weather gear we have. Where are you going?" Caleb turned toward the northern windows, toward the distant peaks where the mist was already gathering. "To get my wife back, if she'll still have me." He left the hall at a run, leaving the chaos behind, leaving the council to clean up the mess he had made, because he had finally realized what Clara had known all along. He hadn't just lost a wife that night in the summit hall. He had lost the only thing that had ever mattered. And he would climb into the frozen hell of the Frost Pass if that's what it took to tell her he was sorry. Chapter 7. The Tower of Birth. The century blizzard arrived on the second night of Caleb's climb, just as the old-timers had predicted. It came from the north like a living wall of white fury, swallowing the peaks one by one until the entire Frost Pass was engulfed in wind and snow so thick that Caleb couldn't see his own hands in front of his face. The temperature plummeted to levels that made his wolf whimper and retreat, and the wind hit with enough force to knock him off his feet twice before he learned to crouch low and move between the gusts. He should have turned back. Any sensible wolf would have. But Caleb Stone had stopped being sensible the moment Tessa's belly had collapsed and he'd realized the full scope of his catastrophic mistake. He climbed higher, following the ghost of a scent that shouldn't have existed. Clara's scent had always been distinctive. Wild honeysuckle and mountain rain, with an undertone of something metallic that he'd eventually identified as the silver in her bloodline. But it had been masked for months, hidden by whatever she'd been using to survive in the pass. He shouldn't have been able to track her at all. But 2 days ago, the scent had returned, faint and changed, now mixed with something sharp and bitter like frozen pine, and beneath that, the unmistakable copper tang of blood, but undeniably hers. It appeared in wisps and traces, carried on updrafts from the highest peaks, and Caleb followed it like a drowning man following a rope to the surface. Milo had given him detailed directions to the last place the scouts had searched, along with a warning: if she survived this long, she doesn't want to be found. And if she is pregnant like I think, she sure as hell doesn't want to see you. Caleb had nodded and kept climbing. The tower appeared through the blizzard like a hallucination, a vertical shadow that didn't belong in the horizontal chaos of the storm. Caleb almost walked past it. His eyes were so frozen and his vision so compromised, but his wolf caught the scent again, stronger now, concentrated, and pushed him toward the dark opening in the stone. He fell through the doorway more than walked, collapsing onto the floor in a heap of ice-crusted furs and numb limbs. The warmth hit him immediately, the blessed shock of a fire burning in the center of the room, and for a moment all he could do was lie there and shake. Then he heard the scream. It was raw and primal, torn from a throat that had already screamed too many times, and it came from somewhere above him in the tower. Caleb forced himself to his knees, his vision clearing enough to take in his surroundings. A single circular room, stone walls, a fire pit, scattered evidence of long-term habitation, and a spiral staircase carved into the wall, leading up. Another scream echoed down the stairs, and this time it ended in a word. No. Caleb climbed. He found her on the second level, in a small chamber that must have once been a watchtower platform. She was on the floor near a makeshift pallet of furs, her back against the wall, her legs drawn up, her face twisted in agony. The emerald gown was long gone, replaced by layered furs and leather that were now soaked with sweat and blood. Her hair, once perfectly maintained and styled, hung in matted tangles around her face. Her hands gripped a wooden pole that had been wedged between two stones, and her knuckles were white with strain. She was in labor, advanced labor, and she was alone. "Clara," Caleb breathed. Her head snapped up, and the look she gave him was pure feral rage. "Get out!" "I'm not." "Get out!" She screamed it with enough force that her whole body convulsed, and another contraction hit her like a physical blow. She doubled over, gasping, her fingers leaving gouges in the wooden pole. Caleb moved on instinct, crossing the room and dropping to his knees beside her. She lashed out immediately, her fist connecting with his jaw hard enough to snap his head back, but he didn't retreat. He caught her wrist gently, carefully, and when she tried to pull away, he let her go. "I know," he said quietly. "I know you don't want me here. I know I have no right. But Clara, you're about to give birth in the middle of a blizzard in a frozen tower, and I am not leaving you to do this alone." "I've been alone for 9 months," she snarled, but her voice broke on the last word. "I survived the cliffs. I survived the winter. I'll survive this." "I know you will." Caleb shrugged off his outer furs, revealing the layers beneath. "You're the strongest person I've ever known, but you don't have to do it alone. Not anymore." Another contraction hit, and this one seemed to last forever. Clara screamed through it, her body arching, her wolf trying to surface but unable to because the shift during labor would kill both her and the child. When it finally passed, she slumped against the wall, panting, tears streaming down her face. "I hate you," she whispered. "I know. You broke me. I know. You threw me away like I was nothing. I know," Caleb's voice cracked. "And I will spend the rest of my life trying to earn your forgiveness. But right now, I need you to let me help you. Please." Clara looked at him with eyes that were storm gray and exhausted and filled with 9 months of pain and rage and loneliness. Then another contraction began, and she grabbed his hand with crushing force. The labor lasted through the night. Caleb had no training as a healer, no knowledge of birth beyond the theoretical, but he did what he could. He built up the fire until the chamber was almost too hot, keeping the killing cold at bay. He gave her water when she could drink it, wiped the sweat from her face with a cloth he tore from his own shirt. When her body began to shake with cold despite the heat, he wrapped himself around her back, using his body heat to keep her core temperature stable. She cursed him, called him every name she could think of in 3 different languages, told him she hoped he died, hoped he suffered, hoped he never knew a moment of peace. And through it all, Caleb held her and took every word like the punishment he deserved. "I'm sorry," he said at one point, his face buried in her sweat-soaked hair, "for all of it, for not trusting the bond, for listening to the counsel, for not seeing what Tessa was, for putting her hands on you, on our child, on everything that should have been sacred. I'm sorry, Clara. I'm so goddamn sorry." She didn't answer. She was too far gone, too deep in the primitive space where her body had taken over and her mind had retreated. But her hand tightened on his, and she didn't pull away. The baby came with the dawn. Clara gave one final, tearing scream that Caleb felt in his own chest, and then there was a new sound in the tower, the thin, outraged wail of a newborn taking her first breath in the frozen air of the highest peak in the northern Highlands. Caleb moved on instinct, catching the tiny blood-slicked body as Clara collapsed backward, her strength finally giving out. He wrapped the baby in the cleanest furs he could find, clearing her mouth and nose the way he'd seen the pack healers do, supporting her tiny head while she screamed her fury at the world. She was perfect. Impossibly small, with a cap of dark hair and skin that would probably lighten to Clara's pale tone, and when she finally opened her eyes, they were the silver gray of the high mountain mist. "A girl," Caleb said, his voice breaking. "Clara, we have a daughter." Clara's eyes fluttered open. She looked at him, at the bundle in his arms, and held out shaking hands. Caleb placed the baby against her chest and watched as Clara's arms came up to cradle her child, their child, with a fierceness that made something crack open in his chest. "Maya," Clara whispered. "Her name is Maya." Outside, the century blizzard raged on, but inside the tower, in a circle of firelight and furs, the first daughter of the Iron Peak drew breath and lived. Chapter 8. The Queen of the North. The blizzard lasted 3 days. During that time, the tower became a world unto itself, isolated from everything beyond its stone walls by a curtain of white fury that made even thinking about the journey down impossible. Caleb kept the fire burning, melted snow for water, and rationed the supplies he'd brought with a precision born of desperation. Clara slept in fits and starts, her body slowly recovering from the ordeal of birth, while Maya nursed and slept and occasionally opened her silver eyes to stare at the world with an intensity that seemed far too ancient for something so small. Caleb watched them both with the reverence of a man who had been given something he didn't deserve and knew it. He didn't try to touch Clara beyond what was necessary, didn't try to hold Maya unless Clara was too exhausted to manage on her own, didn't speak except to ask what she needed or to report on the state of the storm. He existed in the tower like a ghost, useful but unobtrusive, waiting for Clara to acknowledge him or dismiss him or tell him what came next. It was on the 4th morning, when the wind finally died and weak sunlight broke through the tower's broken roof, that Clara spoke. "Tell me what happened." Her voice was rough from screaming and disuse, but it carried the authority of someone who had learned to command in solitude. "Tell me everything." So Caleb told her. He told her about Tessa's mask falling, about the blood-mimic stone and the poisoned water, about the clan's sickness and the stolen relic. He told her about his wolf screaming in Tessa's presence, about the months he'd spent refusing to touch her while the council demanded he consummate a bond that made his skin crawl. He told her about the search parties, about standing on the cliffs and looking toward the peaks, knowing she was alive somewhere but unable to find her. He told her everything except the thing that mattered most, that he loved her, that he had never stopped, that severing the bond had been like cutting out his own heart and trying to live without it. Some things couldn't be said. Not yet, maybe not ever. When he finished, Clara was quiet for a long time. Maya slept against her chest, swaddled in the furs Clara had prepared, her tiny fist curled against her mother's collarbone. Outside, the mountain had gone silent in the way it did after major storms, as if the world itself was holding its breath. "The clan is dying," Clara said finally. It wasn't a question. "Yes. Milo thinks they have maybe a month before the sickness becomes irreversible. The water supply is compromised. The winter stores are gone. And without leadership," he stopped, the words catching in his throat. "Without leadership, they'll fracture." Clara finished. "The southern packs will sense weakness and move in. The council will try to seize power, and the clan will tear itself apart from the inside." "Yes." Clara's hand moved to Maya's back, a protective gesture that was already becoming instinctive. "And you came here instead of staying to lead them through it." "I came here because you are my mate and you were carrying my child and I left you to face the mountain alone." Caleb's voice was raw. I came here because leading a clan means nothing if I've lost my soul in the process. I came here because I had to know you were alive, even if you never forgave me." "I don't forgive you," Clara said, and the words landed like stones. "What you did in that hall, putting her ring on my finger, giving her my mother's moonstone, telling 300 wolves that I was a failure that doesn't get erased because you climbed a mountain and helped me through labor. You broke something, Caleb. Something that doesn't just heal." "I know. But," Clara continued, her gray eyes fixed on the far wall, "I'm not the woman who fled into this past 9 months ago. That woman was broken and desperate and alone. The woman sitting here has survived things that should have killed her. She's hunted her own food, built her own shelter, given birth to a daughter without a healer or a pack or anything but her own will to survive. And that woman knows something the old Clara didn't." She looked at him then, and Caleb saw something in her expression that made him go very still. "The Iron Peak needs a Luna, a real one, not a consort, not a figurehead, not a pretty face for the council to manipulate. They need someone who understands suffering and survival, and what it costs to lead when everything is falling apart." Clara adjusted Maya slightly, her voice growing harder. "They need me." Caleb's heart stuttered. "You'd come back? Not for you, not for the council, not even for the wolves who stood silent while you destroyed me." Clara's gaze dropped to Maya's sleeping face. "For her, because she deserves to inherit a kingdom, not a graveyard. Because she deserves to grow up, knowing her bloodline and her pack and the mountains that shaped her mother into something unbreakable." "Then we go back together," Caleb said. "I'll abdicate if that's what you want. I'll step down from the—" "No." The word was absolute. "You're still the Alpha King. The clan needs stability, and a leadership transition in the middle of a crisis would be catastrophic. You'll keep your title and your authority." Clara's eyes were cold and clear as mountain ice. "But you need to understand something. I'm not coming back as your mate. The bond is severed. What we had is dead." The words hit him like a physical blow, but Caleb forced himself to nod. "I understand." "I don't think you do." Clara shifted, wincing slightly as her healing body protested the movement. "There's an old law in the Highland packs, one that predates the council and the ceremonial bonds. It's called the Law of the Peak. It states that in times of extreme hardship, when a wolf has proven themselves through impossible trials, they can claim leadership through right of survival rather than right of blood." Caleb knew the law. It hadn't been invoked in over 200 years. "I'm invoking it," Clara said. "I survived the Forbidden Frost Pass for 9 months. I gave birth to the first true daughter of the Iron Peak in conditions that should have killed us both. By the law of the Peak, I claim the title of Luna not as your mate, but as the wolf who earned it through trial and blood. The council will never—" "The council has no power anymore," Clara interrupted. "Elder Voss is dying. The others are compromised. And when I walk back into that summit hall with a healthy air on my hip and the proof of my survival written into my skin, they won't dare challenge me. Not when the alternative is watching the clan collapse completely." She was right. Caleb could see it playing out. Clara's return would be mythic, the kind of story that would be told for generations. The discarded Luna who refused to die, who survived the mountain and returned with the true heir. The council would have no choice but to accept her on her terms or face a full uprising from the lower packs, who would see her as a symbol of everything the leadership had failed to be. "What do you need from me?" Caleb asked quietly. "Service," Clara said. "You exist in my court not as my husband, not as my mate, but as the Alpha King who serves at my discretion. You lead the military. You manage the borders. You do the work you were always good at. But the summit hall, the council chambers, the throne itself, those belong to me now. You want redemption? You earn it. Every day. Through service and loyalty and proving that you've learned what it costs to throw away something sacred." Caleb looked at her, this woman he had broken and underestimated, who had been forged into something harder and fiercer in the crucible of the mountain, and felt something settle in his chest. Not peace, not forgiveness, but purpose. "I accept," he said. "I serve at your discretion, Luna." Clara's expression didn't soften, but something flickered in her eyes that might have been approval. "Then get some rest. We leave at first light. The journey down will take 3 days, and I need to be strong enough to walk into that hall on my own feet. And Maya? I'll carry her." Clara's hand curved protectively around her daughter. "Let them see what I fought for. Let them see what I protected while they were dying from their own stupidity and pride." Caleb nodded and moved to the far side of the chamber, giving Clara space. But before he settled down to sleep, he spoke one more time. "For what it's worth, Clara, you were always worthy of that throne. I was just too blind to see it." Clara didn't answer. She was already looking toward the window, toward the descent that awaited them, toward the broken clan that she would either save or bury. Outside, the mountain wind picked up again, carrying the scent of cedar and snow and new beginnings. And in the ancient tower where the first daughter of the Iron Peak had been born, the Queen of the North closed her eyes and dreamed of the kingdom she would reclaim. Not through marriage or politics or birthright, but through survival, through pain, through the unbreakable will of a woman who had learned that the mountain doesn't care about your titles or your bloodlines or your pretty promises. It only cares if you're strong enough to endure. And Clara had proven, beyond any doubt, that she was.